670,000 signatures, a vanished building, a timeline that collapses under the sound of rain, and one forbidden name that refuses to disappear. These are not fragments of a conspiracy theory, nor are they scattered footnotes from a forgotten tragedy. They are the opening symbols of a case that has shaken an entire society, not because of what was shown to the world, but because of everything that was never meant to be seen. In the center of this turmoil stands the death of a young man whose final hours were swiftly wrapped in a narrative of administrative certainty. Yet the deeper one looks, the more that certainty dissolves into contradiction. It begins with a memorial that should have offered closure, but instead revealed a paradox powerful enough to ignite a global search for answers. In the months following his disappearance and death, the silence that surrounded the case was expected to settle like dust. It was meant to blanket the public with a sense of inevitability, the kind that persuades entire populations that questions are futile. Instead, the opposite occurred. The silence produced friction. The friction produced suspicion, and suspicion, once sparked, began to link every inconsistency, every missing detail, and every fragment of suppressed information. What emerged was not a singular accusation, but an expanding constellation of anomalies. A national event broadcast to millions contained a symbol that should never have slipped through layers of review. A major corporate building, physically present and fully operational, disappeared from digital maps. The date of death, repeated as an unmovable fact. Shattered once, rain patterns, ambient sound frequencies, and video reflections were placed beside it. Facts that once appeared immovable now showed signs of careful engineering. For many observers, the most unsettling element was not a single revelation, but the realization that ordinary citizens had begun to rebuild the case piece by piece with a level of precision once expected only from state institutions. Their methods were meticulous, often clinical, and always driven by a desire to resolve what official channels refused to address. They collected atmospheric data, reconstructed vantage points, and cross-referenced microscopic details that most viewers would overlook. Their findings confronted the public with an uncomfortable question. If independent citizens could detect errors in the official timeline, what had been known and what had been altered before the truth ever reached the public? As the global petition gathered signatures across continents, the story transformed from an isolated tragedy into a test of perception. How does a society react when evidence contradicts the version of events it has been told to accept? How does a narrative fracture when millions witness the crack at the same time? In this case, the fracture did not close. Instead, it widened. Every new detail brought more uncertainty, and every uncertainty drew more attention. The question was no longer whether something had gone wrong. The question became how deeply the alteration ran, and what it would cost to expose it. The pursuit of clarity in this case begins with the individual whose name became a point of rupture. Before public outrage surged past national borders, and before independent investigators reconstructed data that challenged the official record, there was a young man whose final movements should have been simple to trace. Instead, those movements dissolved into conflicting accounts, suppressed details, and a carefully arranged timeline that presented itself as factual while resisting verification in every measurable way. His story, when examined through the fragments that survived censorship, reveals a sequence of hours that refused to align with the narrative that was intended to solidify his absence. The official declaration of his death offered a date repeated across multiple platforms with unwavering consistency. It appeared immovable, authoritative, and final, yet its firmness soon became the source of suspicion. A date, after all, is the simplest element of any case file. It is not subject to interpretation. It is not shaped by emotion. It is a timestamp, the bedrock upon which legal and investigative structures stand. When that timestamp begins to falter, everything built upon it falters as well. What independent investigators discovered was not a minor discrepancy or an administrative oversight. They uncovered a fault line. Residents in a residential complex had recorded casual videos over several days, unaware that small reflections in pavement, the rhythm of rainfall, and the hum of environmental noise would later become critical evidence. When these videos were analyzed, frame by frame, when the grain of the audio was passed through spectrum analysis software, And when timestamp metadata was compared against atmospheric archives, contradictions emerged. On the night that the official narrative described as clear, dry, and uneventful, the videos showed wet streets, umbrellas, and the sound of steady rain striking metal and concrete. Light refracted on slick surfaces, creating patterns that could not appear on a dry night. The recordings also captured flashes of emergency lights, their frequencies distinct, their colors mirrored in water pooled on the ground. These details were not ambiguous. They aligned perfectly with meteorological data that confirmed rainfall on an earlier night, a night the official timeline insisted held no significance. The discrepancy was nearly 48 hours, a gap large enough to suggest intention rather than mistake. This gap became known among independent researchers as a buffer period. They approached it not as a rumor or symbolic metaphor, but as a logistical construct. If an incident occurred on the earlier date, then nearly 2 days existed in which scenes could be altered, statements aligned, and digital evidence controlled. Forensic cleanup teams, if mobilized promptly, would have had sufficient time to sanitize locations, remove biological traces, and neutralize environmental indicators that normally persist long after an event. The buffer period also allowed for the rewriting of digital records, surveillance footage, call logs, and routine monitoring data could be collected, edited, or erased. The longer the interval, the more seamless the rewritten timeline could appear. For investigators working outside official channels, the implications were profound. They were no longer dealing with a potential misclassification of time, but with a scenario in which the reported moment of death served a structural purpose. That purpose, they argued, was to ensure that specific individuals within the hierarchy of influence would have publicly verifiable alibis. Appearances at events, meetings, or recorded locations on the later date could be presented as proof of non-involvement, even if the real event had taken place earlier. In this sense, the date became more than a detail. It became a device, one engineered to stabilize a narrative whose authenticity depended entirely on the collapse of scrutiny. Reconstructing the victim's final hours required investigators to abandon traditional channels and rely instead on the fragments that ordinary residents unknowingly documented. Camera angles from upper floors revealed fleeting silhouettes, inconsistent with explanations later provided. The direction of reflected emergency lights suggested the presence of more personnel than publicly acknowledged. Subtle shifts in shadow length demonstrated the timing and movement of vehicles entering restricted zones. When combined, these elements formed a chain of physical events that contradicted the official story, while aligning naturally with the earlier timeline. It was this alignment that gave the reconstruction its strength. It was not grounded in speculation or interpretation. It was anchored in environmental physics, in meteorological precision, and in the immutable laws governing sound, water, and light. The investigators argued that these elements, unlike human testimony, cannot be coerced, revised, or intimidated. When rain falls, it leaves evidence across every surface it touches. When it stops, the drying patterns follow predictable rates influenced by humidity and temperature. When emergency vehicles flash their lights, their pulses reflect with mathematical consistency. Each of these physical fingerprints pointed not to the night claimed by the official narrative, but to the night that had been carefully set aside. The victim's story, once reconstructed through this forensic sequence, painted a portrait not of a solitary tragedy, but of a coordinated effort to manage how that tragedy would be remembered. The intention behind the rewritten timeline remained unspoken, yet the logic behind it became increasingly difficult to dismiss. If the official version required a date that atmospheric evidence refuted, then the narrative was not reporting reality, it was shaping it. And once that shaping became visible, the integrity of every subsequent claim weakened. What emerged from this reconstruction was a sobering realization. The earliest and most foundational layer of the case, the point where every investigation ought to begin, had been deliberately obscured. The deeper investigators probed, the clearer it became that the timeline was designed not to clarify the truth, but to distance it from those who sought to examine it. The victim's final hours, instead of fading into silence, became a map marked by inconsistencies that pointed toward the very thing they were meant to conceal. As the timeline fractured under the weight of physical evidence, attention shifted toward the individuals who refused to let the case dissolve into abstraction. These were not activists in the conventional sense. They were engineers, data analysts, journalists operating outside institutional frameworks, and ordinary women who had mastered the discipline of open-source investigation. They shared neither ideology nor organizational structure. What united them was the recognition that official silence was not an endpoint, but a signal that a parallel inquiry was required. The absence of answers became the catalyst for a new form of investigation that was decentralized, methodical, and increasingly unignorable. Their work began with the simple principle that every covered detail leaves residue somewhere. If information is suppressed in one space, it often leaks into another. They started with the perimeters of the known events, focusing first on physical locations. Under the appearance of daily routine, volunteers visited the areas believed to be connected to the victim's final movements. They documented structural layouts, measured distances between vantage points, and cataloged camera placements. They identified blind spots where surveillance footage could be edited without contradiction, and they recorded inconsistencies in the lighting and terrain that would later support claims regarding altered scenes. What emerged from these initial findings was a map of the environment that contrasted sharply with descriptions provided through official accounts. From physical terrain, the investigation expanded into digital territory. Digital ecosystems, unlike physical ones, can appear orderly on the surface, while concealing deliberate voids underneath. The independent group cross-referenced device pings, vehicle tracking data, and publicly available traffic patterns. They studied timestamps from user-uploaded content that had slipped through moderation algorithms before being scrubbed. By layering these fragments over geospatial mapping tools, they were able to reconstruct movement corridors used by unidentified vehicles linked indirectly to the case. These corridors converged at an unexpected midpoint between two prominent urban landmarks, a location that should have offered no relevance to the narrative as presented. Curiosity pushed the investigators further. They examined satellite imagery purchased from commercial platforms, overlaying multiple dates to detect subtle changes in infrastructure and vehicular activity. Through this process, they identified a large building that appeared consistently on satellite views, yet disappeared entirely from major domestic mapping services. The structure did not merely lack labeling. It was digitally erased. Roads that led directly to it were rerouted in the online maps, creating the illusion of an empty space where a physical complex clearly existed. This discrepancy represented more than a technical oversight. It demonstrated an intentional manipulation of digital cartography, the kind that requires coordination among platforms that normally function independently. The investigators concluded that the building housed a powerful, private media conglomerate with deep institutional ties, a discovery that intensified speculation about what connected this location to the victim's case. The digital erasure raised a deeper concern. If a structure of such size could be removed from public view with no formal justification, then digital space had become another environment in which reality could be selectively edited. In this context, the investigators viewed the disappearance not as an anomaly, but as corroborating evidence of a systematic effort to obscure activity associated with the case. The presence of a physical building is verifiable. Its absence on digital maps is a choice. While the investigation gained momentum, ordinary channels for communication within the country grew increasingly restricted. Large social media platforms tightened filters around keywords and blocked entire discussion threads. Accounts that referenced atmospheric evidence, satellite discrepancies, or elements of the independent report were quickly muted. Yet the public adapted with remarkable speed. They migrated to spaces that were not designed for political discourse, exploiting technical loopholes that the censorship apparatus had overlooked. The most striking method emerged from an unexpected corner of daily life. Food delivery applications. These platforms included a text field originally meant for simple cooking instructions. Because of the immense volume of orders processed every minute, the field was not monitored with the same scrutiny applied to social media posts. Users began inserting brief messages about the case statements, fragments of unofficial findings, and warnings about the timeline inconsistency. Restaurant workers, drivers, and recipients captured screenshots and quietly circulated them through private channels. The process was slow, repetitive, and far from efficient, yet it proved resilient. The more the system attempted to restrict conventional communication, the more inventive the public became. When authorities eventually detected the pattern, they implemented a sweeping measure that stunned even seasoned observers. The note-taking feature was disabled nationwide. The decision hindered millions of legitimate transactions across the country, revealing a critical shift. The response was no longer about guiding public perception. It was about preventing any leakage of information at all, regardless of the cost to everyday commerce. The public interpreted this drastic action not as a show of strength, but as evidence of institutional anxiety. A mechanism designed to control food orders had been transformed into a battleground of information, and the authorities chose to dismantle the mechanism entirely, rather than allow it to become a conduit of dissent. This escalation triggered a wave of symbolic acts that demonstrated how deeply the case had penetrated public consciousness. At a small local print shop, workers reported receiving an explicit directive prohibiting the printing of any material containing the victim's name, even in isolation from context. The prohibition was not broad. It targeted 3 simple characters. By outlawing the appearance of a name, the system inadvertently confirmed its sensitivity. Language itself had become contraband. The most visible act of defiance came from an individual who displayed a banner on a vehicle with a simple call for justice. The gesture was minimal in form, but profound in consequence. In an environment where words could not be printed, and where digital space dissolved anything deemed dangerous, a physical banner moving through public streets became a rare artifact of unfiltered expression. The symbol traveled farther than any message in a food delivery note. It crystallized the sentiment that silence was no longer an acceptable posture. Through these acts, one truth became unmistakable. A system designed to suppress information had unintentionally proven how widespread the desire for answers had become. The independent investigation no longer belonged to a small cluster of analysts. It had transformed into a collective undertaking, one that expanded each time a new restriction was imposed. Censorship ceased to conceal the narrative. Instead, it revealed the extent of institutional fear and amplified the urgency of the questions that remained unresolved. As the investigation expanded beyond the events of a single night, a different pattern began to emerge, one that seemed at first unrelated to the victim's case. It surfaced quietly through scattered observations, rumors, and public appearances that did not fit within the boundaries of ordinary explanation. The anomalies centered on figures from the entertainment sphere, individuals well known to audiences for decades. They had visibly aged in the public eye, their declining health documented through interviews, performances, and photographs. Then, without warning, they reappeared transformed. Faces tightened, posture strengthened, mobility restored, vitality renewed. The changes were not gradual, and doctors offered no public explanations, grounded in conventional medicine. The transformations were abrupt enough to suggest not recovery, but replacement. Ordinary observers may have dismissed these appearances as products of cosmetic procedures or digital refinement. However, the scale of the transformations challenged such assumptions. One performer, previously frail and battling chronic illness, returned with the physique of a younger individual and skin that appeared unnaturally smooth. Another, celebrated for decades yet visibly aging, was suddenly photographed, engaging in demanding physical activity with an ease that defied her earlier condition. A third, who had long required a wheelchair due to significant health issues, was recorded walking without assistance and practicing martial disciplines in a public park. Each case, on its own, could be explained away. Taken together, they formed a cluster of anomalies too consistent to ignore. Speculation intensified when a prominent business figure in the beauty industry publicly described her own experience with radical age reversal. Speaking with an unsettling tone of normality, she rejected cosmetic surgery and hormone therapy entirely. Instead, she described a process she referred to as whole-body replacement, a phrase that suggested biological exchange rather than enhancement. According to her, the procedure relied on what she called functional proteins, derived from the circulatory systems of healthy males between 16 and 21 years of age. She presented the revelation as if discussing a luxury product, never acknowledging the ethical implications that her words immediately raised. Her explanation deepened concerns among independent analysts who had been studying irregularities in the case. If the process she described was genuine, it implied a system that required continuous sources of biological material. She disclosed that the treatment demanded a monthly cost equivalent to 20 million units of domestic currency, a number so immense that it placed the procedure beyond the reach of all but a very small elite. More importantly, she stated that the process had to be repeated regularly to maintain visible results. The implications were stark. An industry of age reversal would require not occasional supply, but a continuous stream of biological extraction at a scale approaching industrial demand. The question that followed was unavoidable. Where could such material originate? The answer did not appear immediately, but the clues were already present. For years, schools across the country had implemented health programs that included large-scale collection of blood samples and genetic material from students. The rationale was always portrayed as public health monitoring. Yet the volume of collection, combined with the centralization of data, raised questions long before the victim's case drew international attention. The broader public dismissed concerns as overreactions. However, in the context of resurfacing information about age reversal, the earlier collections took on a more sinister tone. More troubling still was a pattern uncovered by independent researchers examining missing person reports. In a span of 22 days, 107 disappearances of teenagers and young adults were recorded, each vanishing with minimal media attention and almost no official explanation. In a nation with hundreds of millions of surveillance cameras, capable of tracking pedestrians and vehicles in real time, the absence of footage documenting their movements was inexplicable. Surveillance systems that could identify individuals at great distances suddenly appeared to lose all resolution when tasked with locating missing youths. The coincidence strained credibility. The investigators began to view these elements not as isolated anomalies, but as parts of a sequence. At the beginning of the sequence stood the collection of biological data. In the middle were disappearances that defied the abilities of one of the most extensive surveillance networks on Earth. At the end were rejuvenated public figures, restored almost beyond recognition. The hypothesis that emerged was not framed as accusation, but as correlation. If an industry required biological material, and if individuals matching the described profile were vanishing, then the possibility of a closed-loop system could not be dismissed. This perspective shifted the interpretation of the victim's case. His death was no longer viewed solely through the lens of an isolated crime or a political misstep. It became part of a broader ecology, one in which secrecy was the primary currency. Independent investigators speculated that he may have approached information or environments that connected him, intentionally or otherwise, to this larger structure. The severity of the response to his presence, the speed of the cover-up, and the magnitude of institutional resources deployed all suggested that his case threatened to expose more than a single wrongdoing. It threatened to reveal the existence of a mechanism that required silence to function. The notion that human life had become a resource within such a mechanism was difficult for many to confront. Yet the circumstantial connections were stark. Anomalous rejuvenation required supply. Supply required sourcing. Sourcing required invisibility. Invisibility required control over information, digital space, and public narrative. When viewed through this lens, the disappearance of buildings from digital maps, the collapse of the timeline, the suppression of a name, and the vanishing of young individuals were no longer disconnected phenomena. They were structural features of a system designed to sustain itself. The victim's involvement, whether intentional or accidental, appeared to have disrupted this system. His death and the ensuing attempts to mask its circumstances operated not as a reaction to a personal dispute or isolated wrongdoing, but as a defensive maneuver aimed at preserving the integrity of a much larger operation. In this context, his silencing was not merely the removal of a single individual. It was a message directed at a landscape of hidden processes, demonstrating the consequences of approaching truths that were not meant to surface. By the time independent investigators assembled the constellation of evidence, the narrative had shifted irreversibly. What began as a single tragedy had expanded into an examination of a parallel structure of power, operating in the shadows of public life. The lingering question was no longer whether the victim had encountered something dangerous, but what scale of secrecy required such an extensive response to protect itself. When the fragments of this case are placed beside one another, a pattern emerges that is impossible to ignore. The death of a single individual, initially framed as a contained event with a clear timeline, evolved into a rupture that exposed weaknesses within an entire informational structure. It revealed how fragile an official narrative becomes when confronted with the persistence of physical evidence. It demonstrated how ordinary citizens, armed with nothing more than discipline, analytical rigor, and an unwillingness to accept silence as truth, could reconstruct a sequence of events with greater precision than institutions designed to perform that very task. And above all, it illustrated how one life, when suppressed, can illuminate the machinery that attempted to hide it. The collapse of the timeline was the first break. Once the atmospheric data contradicted the stated date of death, every subsequent detail lost its presumption of reliability. The buffer period, reconstructed from environmental fingerprints and civilian analysis, suggested an intentional re-engineering of time itself. From there, the inconsistencies multiplied. A building disappeared from digital maps while remaining fully present in satellite imagery. Surveillance systems that routinely track millions lost visibility precisely when accountability was required. Digital communication channels were shut down, not because they posed security threats, but because they allowed truth to move through spaces that censorship had not yet mastered. In parallel, a disturbing pattern of rejuvenation among prominent public figures began to intersect with the case in unexpected ways. Statements made casually during a live stream hinted at a biological economy operating beneath public awareness, one that demanded continuous supply and enormous resources. The disappearances of young individuals, coupled with years of mandatory biological data collection in schools, widened the lens through which the victim's death had to be viewed. If such an ecosystem existed, even partially, then approaching or exposing it would have triggered the type of extreme suppression recorded in this case. By the end of 2 months, the narrative was no longer controlled by the institutions that sought to define it. It belonged to the public, carried forward by independent investigators who refused to relinquish the search for clarity. The victim's name, once targeted for erasure, became a symbol repeated in whispers, screenshots, private channels, and acts of public defiance. Attempts to silence discussion only intensified attention. Each restriction became a confirmation that there was something worth protecting and something worth uncovering. What remains now is the question at the heart of this entire investigation. What is the cost of truth in a system built to avoid it? The answer, reflected through the victim's story, is sobering. Truth extracts a price from those who pursue it, but it also imposes a cost on those who attempt to bury it. In this case, the attempt to eliminate a narrative created another one, stronger, clearer, and far more difficult to control. The individual whose death was meant to disappear instead became a point of irrevocable exposure. His name survives, not because it was permitted to, but because the truth surrounding it could not be extinguished. In every society, there comes a moment when silence fractures. For many, this case marked that moment.